Hello everyone, welcome to Cinema Mancuso, and this is Notes on the News. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the biggest stories in film, media, and entertainment, and give you my thoughts. If you're joining us live, super happy to have you. If at any point during the show you have any questions or comments about any of the topics I'm covering, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll do my best to kind of keep an eye on that as we kind of move along. Please like this live stream, it really helps. I don't just mean like it in your heart and soul, but like click the little thumbs up button. It really does help with the algorithm and the metrics and all of that. And subscribe if you're stumbling upon this and you haven't subscribed yet. If you're watching this after the fact, also super happy to have you. Again, same deal. Please like and subscribe. It really does help with people discovering the channel. We're growing slowly but surely. And without further ado, why don't we jump in and get started? So let's take a look at the box office from this past weekend. Total domestic box office returns from this past weekend, May 10th to, the 12th. 93 million total. So this is a 26% jump from the previous weekend, and that is due in large part to the number one film this weekend, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. This is I don't even know what Planet of the Apes movie this is, but this is like the fourth in this like kind of rebooted, originally just a trilogy, but I guess the creators just announced that they want to do like a 9-film saga in this rebooted series, so maybe this is the fourth. Maybe we're not even halfway through yet, but this has opened pretty well. Opened at about 57 million for the weekend, and that's really good. It was projected around 45 to 58. That's what I had projected, and based off of I'm gonna for full context when I talk about like the projections. Typically, I've just been like pulling from other places. I'm going to start like actually trying to like look through the data of like past films in a franchise or past directors' work and comparable films, try to come up with my own estimates. But so in any case, this brought in about 57, and that was just at the very top of that projection. So the very good opening from this past weekend. I'm curious now, I'm going to kind of do this live. I'm going to pull up the past weekend's or this year's box office results and see. This is one of the bigger weekends of the year so far. Not, I think this is the 19th weekend that we've had in 2024, and this is definitely one of the, not like the top 5 biggest, but this definitely has helped, which I'm surprised about. I didn't think people loved this franchise. The people who loved it really loved it, but it didn't really seem like it had like the cultural cachet, if you will, to make a huge splash at the box office. But I think this is like perfect timing. This feels like a great release date for this film, like kind of beginning the summer season. I feel like we've talked about beginning the summer season like 3 or 4 times now, but Hollywood, it keeps like not really quite happening. So it was like, oh, The Falls Guy's gonna be the beginning. Nah, actually, you know what? That was disappointing. Planet of the Apes is the real start of the summer box office. And this is all off of a $160 million budget, so it still has a long ways to go before making that back, but it has already made $129 million worldwide. So again, very impressive for a film that I still have yet to see. I'm seeing it this week. I'm sure is quite good, but just doesn't have, I just don't think has the cultural capital to warrant, success like this. But also we'll just have to see how it holds, because I don't know. If it gets good word of mouth, I could see this having some legs, but, I might be completely wrong come next week and it's dropped 63% or something crazy. But so that's the only really new film coming out that made it into the top 10. Looking at films that are continuing into their second frame, we have at number 2, The Fall Guy, like I mentioned, bringing in only 14 million this week. So it dropped from its first place spot when it first opened now to second. And this is a 51% drop. So not very good. It could have been way worse, like I said, like 60%, 70%. But obviously not very good, considering that it didn't really make a huge splash in its first weekend. So this brings its domestic total to about 50 million, and its worldwide total to 104. But again, this is all off of like $125, $150 million budget. So again, it still has a long way to go to even break even. I released my review for it. I thought it was fun. Nothing more than that, though. I didn't think it was particularly great, but I thought it was a great start off to the summer box office, or the summer movie release season. But I guess audiences have not felt the same way. Also continuing this week at number 4 is Tarot, bringing in $3.5 million for the weekend. It held its 4th place spot in its second frame. A 40% drop, so again, not awful, but certainly not great. And this brings its domestic total to $12 million and its worldwide total to $20 million. But this is all off of an $8 million budget. And I think I talked about this last week. That's the appeal of horror films like this, is that they don't really make a lot of money, but they're usually very cheap. And, so even a film that has not really done super well critically at all, this is technically a financial success, right? And then the reason why studios make so many horror films is because if one of those can actually be like really financially successful, huge return on investment. So let me pull up quickly something like Get Out, which is nothing like this movie. It is nothing like Tarot, but just like another horror film made for really cheap. It was made for only $4.5 million, so less than this. And that ended up bringing in worldwide over $250 million. That's a huge percent return, right? So we're kind of seeing that play out here. It's not even the same category as Get Out in terms of quality or success. Like, I don't see this getting like 50 million worldwide, but again, it was pretty cheap. So, it incentivized studios to keep making more films like this. Looking at some other stuff in the top 5 here. At number 3, we have Challengers, bringing in $4.7 million for the weekend. Held its 3rd place spot in its 3rd frame. Only a 38% drop. This was something that I had talked about. I was surprised to see it not make as big of a splash when it first opened, but it seems to be doing okay if it can kind of keep the momentum going. It's brought in about $38 million domestically and a $69 million worldwide off of a $55 million budget. So this is definitely in the mid-budget kind of category, which Hollywood just doesn't get a lot of anymore. Films are either like $1 million or $100 million. So again, you look at something like The Fall Guy, which like to my mind was like, oh, that's kind of like a more pared down mid-budget movie. But no, that's like almost $150 million it cost to make that movie, right? So, this still has a bit of a ways to go to try to recoup those costs, but critically, this film has done super, super well. So, again, I'm curious if it can kind of keep some momentum going as like the weeks and months go on. But again, it's going to become a very crowded box office space. Though it's not going to be as crowded as other summers would be, right? Because we're still feeling the effects of the strikes. So, I was looking at the summer release schedule this morning just to kind of be like, well, what is coming out? And there's not like a huge amount of like, oh, that's going to make a bajillion dollars, right? Right now it's really Deadpool and Wolverine. And that's like the only thing really coming to mind. Let me see if I can pull it up quickly here. So in terms of things that could end up making a good amount of money, the Furiosa movie, Garfield maybe, if families like it, The Fourth Bad Boys, Inside Out 2, perhaps, A Quiet Place, like the prequel to the original Quiet Place, Despicable Me 4. So there's actually a good amount of stuff. The Deadpool and Wolverine, and then maybe Borderlands. But again, like all of those things feel like medium successes. None of those scream like huge hits the way Barbie or even Oppenheimer were, right? Also in the top 5, we have number 5, Godzilla x Kong, The New Empire. Still in the top 5. Or maybe it's dropped out of the 5 and come back in. But this is its 7th weekend in the top 10. Only bringing about $2.5 million. But again, it's all about just, that's $2.5 million that Warner Brothers didn't have before. This is only a 44% drop, and this is easily one of the most successful films of the year, both domestically and worldwide, off of and has made back its budget because it's brought in about like almost $200 million domestically and like $560 million worldwide off of like $150 million budget. So again, I don't understand. I've said this like every week. I don't understand how this is done so well because, from what I understand, people don't. It's kind of middling, but what can you do? A couple other shout outs here in terms of things that have been here in the top 10 for quite some time now. Number 7, we have Kung Fu Panda 4, bringing just a humble $2 million. Dropped from 7th to 8th place in its 10th frame. So it's been in the top 10 for 10 consecutive weekends now. And this is only a 21% drop. This brings its domestic total to 191 million, and its worldwide total to about 529 million. So actually pretty comparable to Godzilla x Kong, but this was like maybe like half the budget, or maybe like 2/3 of the budget at 85 million. So this has also been like a very successful film that, again, is surprising considering that the reviews weren't particularly great. But I guess families are just like, you know, it's just like a good go-to for bringing the whole family, right? And again, that's why Hollywood loves family films, because, you know, the kids can't. It's really just for the kids, but the kids don't want to. A 7-year-old's not going to go by themselves, right? So you have 2 siblings, and you have the mom and dad, or mom and dad and dad, right? The parental units, and so that's like already like 4 or 5 people, right there, right? So family films are always gonna have that added benefit. And then also still in the top 10 here at number 8, we have Civil War, bringing in just 1.8 million for the weekend. It dropped from 6th place to 8th in its 5th frame. So it's been in theaters for over a month now and still in the top 10. This is about a 49% drop. But this is, this brings its total domestically up to 65 million and 108 million worldwide off of just a $50 million budget. And I believe this is like the most expensive A24 film ever, and it was the biggest opening for a film ever. I'd be curious to see if this is the biggest if this is the biggest total, box office total for A24 ever. I could see something like, Everything Everywhere All at Once having a bigger total box office, because that one just had really good legs. As of right now, Everything Everywhere All at Once beats it out at like 143 million worldwide. But I mean, if this can kind of keep going, in the next couple of weeks and months, it could, again, become A24's. It might send A24 the signal, good or bad, depending on how you view it, that, if we put more money into these movies, we can make more money, which could potentially dilute the brand and lead to A24 kind of becoming something that it's not, or it shouldn't be. But again, only time will tell. Okay. Just before moving on, I want to give a quick plug. So Cinema and QSO started as, it's not just a YouTube channel, it started as and still is a Substack newsletter where I write more formal reviews for new films coming out every week. I just wanted to plug some reviews that I got up right now. So over here we have the Irish drama Nowhere Special, which I thought was quite great. And then over here we also have a Challengers. That's a full-length review where I kind of talk about, why I feel like the film has really struck the zeitgeist in a sense. And then over here we have the Fall Guide. So again, you can find all these reviews at the link in the description. You can also just go into your browser and type in cinemaandhuso.substack.com. Okay, let me just grab a quick drink here. Okay. So let's talk about story number 1 here. So this whole story feels like a nothing story, in the sense that the conclusions that highly paid multimillionaire Hollywood executives, the conclusion that they have reached is so common sense that it makes me want to slap them. Because they're trotting out these conclusions like they've stumbled upon the holy grail of business strategy. So Disney's Bob Iger, CEO, pictured here, right, has announced that Marvel Studios' output in terms of the MCU, whether it be films or television productions like on Disney Plus, that Marvel's output will decrease substantially going forward. So for 2024, for this year, the only Marvel film releasing is going to be Deadpool and Wolverine, that third Deadpool film. That's going to be releasing in July. There's still 4 films planned for 2025, but that's kind of like a vestige of their previous release strategy. So we're going to have Captain America Brave New World, which is essentially Falcon and the Winter Soldier, the movie. That's going to be coming out in February of 2025. And then Thunderbolts in May, The Fantastic Four in July, and then if it ends up actually getting made, Blade in November, which is great timing. Though I maybe would have put it in October, but they I would say they know what they're doing, but recent events have shown that maybe they don't. But then going forward, the idea is to really pull back on the output. So we have this a quote here from Iger saying, quote, "I've been working hard with the studio to reduce output and focus more on quality. That's particularly true with Marvel movies and television shows. Some of what is coming up is a vestige of basically a desire in the past to increase volume. We're slowly going to decrease volume and go to probably about 2 TV series a year instead of what had become 4, and reduce our film output from maybe 4 a year to 2 to the maximum 3, end quote. So essentially what Bob Iger is saying is, we realized maybe if we focus on quality over quantity, these films will both be better and do better financially. Duh! Like, it's just insane that these people get paid millions and millions and millions of dollars. This is not the first time Bob Iger has said this. I think he alluded to this a couple months ago. I was going to do a story about it, but it just ended up being a busier week, and there was more interesting stuff to talk about. But, everyone was just like roasting Disney and Bob Iger on social media. And I think I saw like a funny tweet where it was like, disgruntled Disney executives sitting in a boardroom. They've been there for days. They don't know what to do. And then someone gets up without saying anything and opens up the marker and writes, "Make good movies." And everyone goes, "What?" So here's like the context for all of this. So, Marvel's output, specifically when it comes to like Disney, Marvel Studios, like the MCU, has slowly but surely kind of grown over, basically grew over its first decade. So you look at phase 1 of the MCU, it was basically like 1 film a year, sometimes 2, but typically just 1 film a year. And then phase 2, it eventually grew to 2 films a year. And then by the end of phase 3, we were getting up to 3 films a year. So like in that last year of 2019 when Endgame came out, we had Captain Marvel in the early part of the year, then Endgame, of course, and then in the summer, Spider-Man Far From Home, right? So this output basically amounts to roughly 2 films a year, 23 films over an 11-year period. And this, of course, as we all know, was a huge cash cow for Marvel and Disney. And it seemed like the MCU was designed to be a cash cow, in the sense that, you were able to get to that point where you could release 3 a year, and they were all mammothly successful. Right? I think in 2019, Disney had 7 films cross $1 billion. 2 of those were Marvel. 1 of those, being Endgame, almost got $3 billion. And technically, they had another film cross $1 billion, Spider-Man Far From Home, but they shared that with Sony, of course. But again, that's another film that was so successful. And the reason why this worked is because, in general, in terms of like the content, theoretically, though some people have complained, me being one of them, that this is not quite true, but the films were different enough to not feel oversaturated yet, right? Because obviously that became an issue later. So they were different enough not to feel oversaturated, yet due to the narrative connections, people wanted to see everything. They wanted to make sure that they saw this film, even if it doesn't seem like it's super important, because then it might get referenced later. And at the very least, it'll be like a fun Easter egg that kind of rewards you for having seen them all. Or it could even be as important as like, this character is now super important to this film, and they were introduced over here, right? So it seemed like a money printing machine, right? Following Endgame, this is where I think Disney and Marvel, but I think specifically Disney, got greedy, right? And they really wanted that gravy train to continue. So, this is all tied into... So you have all the films, right? And a lot of this got, shook up due to the pandemic. Like, the first post-Endgame film, I guess besides Spider-Man Far From Home, but that was almost felt like an epilogue to Endgame. The first Phase 4 MCU film, Black Widow, was going to come out like May of 2020. And then, of course, the pandemic thwarted everything, right? So that was like a forced pause. But the plan was to still release like 3 films in 2020 or however many it was going to be. Eventually maybe getting up to like 4 films, right? So that's its own thing, which could start to get grating because it's more films a year than we have ever had before. And we just finished off the saga, and a lot of people wanted Marvel and Disney to take a break and to take a pause and let people miss the MCU, right? So all of what I just described would already be a problem. But at the same time, in late 2019, Disney launches Disney Plus, right? In their big effort to beat Netflix at their own game, which everyone in retrospect has decided that all of these studio-owned streaming services was a huge mistake. It's starting to get better, but it's had a lot of it's becoming successful in spite of itself, right? But what do you need on a streaming service like Netflix? You need content, right? And Disney especially does not have the library that some of these other studios have, because for most of their history they were very specialized. Focusing on the animated films, right, as like the core kind of core asset that the company has. That's obviously expanded, and it was even expanding back in like the 40s and 50s with like more live action content. But that's obviously way different now. But even when you include like Marvel and Star Wars and Lucasfilm and now 20th Century Fox, which is the primary reason why they bought 20th Century Fox, was to have that content, it still needs to make as much content as possible, especially original content. So, Disney Plus really became, it really seemed like Disney was leaning on Marvel and Marvel Studios and Kevin Feige to supply a huge percentage of this original content. So in 2021, and again, this is maybe a little bit unfair because some of this probably would have come out in 2020 and it kind of got all smushed in 2021, but 2021 saw 5 new Marvel shows on Disney Plus. WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Loki, Hawkeye, and if you also want to include it, the animated What If series. So that is just, even if you count the shows as a movie, and really we should count them as like 2 or 3 movies because they're so long, but let's just count them as 1. 5 shows, 4 movies, 20, that's like 9 different things. So naturally fatigue's set in, right? And again, this was natural after Endgame, and I don't necessarily know if the quality of this content got worse, but people got tired of it, right? It felt like it was getting worse. I would argue that the highs were just as high and the lows were just as low, but because they were getting so much of it, it's not that there was oversaturation, but more so when you see 9 things versus like 2 or 3 things of the year, the flaws that are common throughout all of them really jump out, right? Because you're getting inundated with it all of the time, right? And this really culminated in this past year in 2023 with Quantumania, not doing awful, but that was meant to be almost like an Avengers level event introducing Kang, which of course is like a whole other piece of drama, right? But then the Marvels in the fall of last year that just completely just tanked at the box office and also just wasn't super well received, right? So this decision to publicly say like we're going to reduce the output feels like an admission of failure, at least in terms of the strategy, right? So to be fair, Bob Iger, had left the company like right before COVID, and has now come back because he was like, please, Bob Iger, help us. You are our only hope. But admittedly, even though he was gone when all this really went downhill, he's the one who created the conditions for this. Again, it was his mandate, more or less, that, to create all this content so they could try to be competitive in the streaming wars, right? So ultimately, this decision hurt the brand. So Marvel across, beyond just the Disney Plus shows, Marvel has just, as a brand, has just been severely weakened. And they didn't beat Netflix, right? And they're nowhere even close to reaching Netflix's subscriber numbers. We have a quote here from Louis Despacito, who's the co-president of Marvel Studios, saying, quote, "If we just stayed on top, that would have been the worst thing that could have happened to us. We took a little hit, we're coming back strong. Maybe when you do too much, you dilute yourself a little bit. We're not going to do that anymore. We learned our lesson. Maybe 2 to 3 films a year and 1 or 2 shows as opposed to doing 4 films and 4 shows," end quote. Again, great point. Did you need to go through the past 5 years to arrive to that conclusion? I could have told you that in your board meetings in 2019 when you were deciding to do all this stuff. And there's something to this idea of diluting, right? Because ultimately, whether you thought the MCU was great or awful or somewhere in the middle, whatever you thought, having more content, it does mean that everyone, particularly Kevin Feige, who is like the main overseer of everything, is spread way more thin, right? And again, I kind of like this quote because it's kind of like, it's actually a good thing that we failed so spectacularly. I'm like, yeah, but like you are really trying to make lemonade out of some self-inflicted lemons here. Also, just this is like a sidebar, but like, where's Feige in all of this? Like, we've been hearing people say stuff like this, like Bob Iger for like months now. But where's Kevin Feige? Because I feel like he used to always be front and center when it came to talking about like the trajectory and the business strategies of the MCU. We do have a quote from him here though, saying, quote, "It's nice to be able to rally behind one feature project this year. I'm much more comfortable being the underdog. I prefer being able to surprise and exceed expectations. So it does seem like the last year, which has not been ideal, has set us up well for that," end quote. And he's referencing there how the creation of the MCU was very much an underdog project. Because essentially, not to get too much into history, but by the what was it, like the 90s, Marvel had basically sold off the movie rights to a bunch of its most popular characters in order to avoid, to kind of get some influx of, Marvel Comics was not doing particularly well financially. So that's why you kind of saw them all spread out at different studios. So you had Spider-Man over at Sony, and you had Hulk at Universal, and you had the X-Men and Fantastic Four with Fox, and it was all spread out like that. Well, by the mid-2000s, seeing the success of the X-Men films and Spider-Man, Marvel decided, well, why don't we make our own films with the characters we still have the movie rights to? So who was that? All of like the B-list characters. So Iron Man is considered one of the premier Marvel characters now. 20 years ago, he was not particularly well known to the general population. To comic book fans, he was super important. But most people, he was not up there with Spider-Man and Wolverine and Hulk and characters like that. So when they made the first Iron Man, it was really a big bet. They basically didn't have a shooting script. They were basically improvising it on set. We had Robert Downey Jr. cast, who was basically a washed-up alcoholic actor who, basically had hit rock bottom. You have Jon Favreau directing, who is primarily known for directing comedies like Swingers and Elf. So I could see where Kevin Feige is coming from, where it was like there is something to being the underdog and being able to exceed expectations, whereas when you are the top dog, even the most mild of disappointments or failures really stick out, right? And again, but again, this whole thing over like quality over quantity, again, it just feels like an obvious, like there's a reason why that phrase exists. No one has ever said quantity over quality. So I don't know why you thought that would work. Again, and kind of reiterating what I've said, I disagree somewhat with the premise of superhero fatigue. This idea that like, oh, these movies aren't doing well because there's just so many of them and audiences are getting bored. If people will watch them if they're good, or they're novel, or they're interesting, or they do something new with the genre. That'd be like saying, oh, they make so many movies. It's like, yeah, because you could make 500 great movies. You know what I mean? By all different kinds of movies and all different styles and different tastes. And it just feels that the idea of like there just being too much of superhero films, I think just shows an incredible lack of imagination. So to tie all this up, so what's the future of the MCU? This goes without saying, it's not just about reducing the output. The films that they do put out need to take more risks. Right? Creative risks. Because if you look at what have been the most successful superhero films, and I don't just mean in terms of box office, but in terms of the cultural impact. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films, particularly the first two. The third one was a misstep, but I quite like it, but I also grew up with it, right? But the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight films, MCU films like Iron Man, and to an extent, the Avengers. And if you want to look at something more modern, DC's Joker, right? Something completely different that I think is a kind of mediocre movie, but it also made over $1 billion off of a pretty small budget compared to some other superhero films or comic book based films, right? So what do all those have in common? It was a director's vision. You can debate if the vision was good or if the films were good, but it was a director's vision. So I think that is going to be essential for striking lightning in a bottle again, right? Another thing that the MCU needs to do, it needs to focus more on characters and their arcs, right? And focusing on characters doesn't mean giving characters cool moments to do cool stuff. I'm talking about, classic story and narrative and actual opportunities for characters with flaws and goals to have opportunities for change. And again, all those examples I just listed have all that, right? Because eventually these MCU movies stopped being about even like mediocrely basic character growth, not even like throwaway character arcs. Like these films really stopped being about anything remotely interesting. And in addition to like I was saying before about taking risks, showing us something creatively new, but also just literally showing us something new, right? So, we're finally going to get the Fantastic Four and eventually the X-Men into the MCU, right? We've never seen those interpretations, right? And some would argue we've never had a good Fantastic Four film. So if they can stick the landing on those two properties, it could save the MCU. But I'm almost of the mind, I don't know if I want to see the MCU get saved. And it probably just needs a clean reboot. Just a clean wipe, do some final huge crossover multiverse event that kind of like what they did in the comics, where it was just a nice clean reset. And that would be really interesting to see, because unlike in the mid-2000s, Marvel now has all the toys in the toy box. They have all of those characters. They don't have to try to build a team out of B-list characters. They can have and they can make from the jump Spider-Man work with Hulk, who's working with Wolverine. Like, you can do them all however you want to do it. That's kind of where I'm at. And that's what I would like to see, but, only time will tell. We have a comment here. Where does Kevin, presumably Feige, where does Kevin fit into this? How does he feel about the downscaling? Again, that may have been before I was talking about Kevin, but again, we don't really know. And that's a really good question. We don't really know how he feels. The impression I've always gotten is this mandate for more content was imposed on him inherently, but that's not to say that he resented it or disagreed with it. Because again, he's a Marvel nerd first and foremost. And I say that completely with love. I don't say that as like a pejorative. So I would not be surprised if this was a mandate, which he was like, okay, great. If you're going to give me the money to make all this stuff, that's great, because I want to do all these kinds of stories, right? And tackle all these characters in different material. Again, it's just, I think he slowly realized that he just couldn't sustain. Again, he's just spread way too thin. He just can't kind of have that quality control that, you'd be able to have when it's less films or just less projects. Because again, the shows are basically just like long films. So, having 8 projects, whether they're shows or movies, come out in a year, that's a lot. Even for Kevin Feige, the Hollywood's Wonder Boy in terms of franchise producing, that's just that might be a little bit out of reach. Okay, let me just grab a quick drink. If you're joining us, please like the stream. It really does help with the algorithm and engagement and all of that stuff. Okay. Let's talk about story number 2 here. So, in a historic milestone, Disney and Warner Brothers are teaming up to offer a streaming bundle of Disney Plus, Hulu, and Max, the artist formerly known as HBO Max. Of course, Disney Plus and Hulu are both owned by Disney, and then Max being owned by Warner Brothers. No price for this bundle has been announced yet. The New York Times does note that if you were to get each of the services separately, it would currently cost $25 a month if you were to get the ad-supported version of those, and then $48 a month for the ad-free versions of all those. But despite us not having a price, this bundle is set to launch sometime this summer. So it shouldn't be too long before we get an announcement on the price. Presumably, it'll be cheaper than that $25 and $48, right? Again, it will have both ad-free and ad-supported options. This is not an integration, okay? So this is not like how Disney recently integrated Hulu into Disney Plus, where you can watch Hulu content through your Disney Plus app. That is not what this is. You'd be able to do that with Hulu, presume on Disney Plus, but these are still separate apps, and especially between the Disney stuff and Max, like you're basically getting a cheaper price for the whole thing by bundling, but Max is you're still going to log into Max on a separate app, right? And IndieWire reported a report from CNBC saying that reportedly Disney will handle the distribution of this bundle, and Max and Warner Brothers will get a fee for every new subscriber. So that's kind of the calculus of that. And again, like I mentioned, this feels like a milestone in the streaming era. Deadline notes that this is the first cross-company partnership or bundle for one of the top-tier streaming services, right? And this comes in the context of other potential partnerships that have been announced or could potentially be announced. Like, for example, these two parties, Disney and Warner Brothers, are already working together with Fox Sports on a joint sports streaming venture nicknamed Spulu, right? It's like kind of a play on Hulu, but for sports. So that's already been announced, months ago. So why, I kind of outlined a little bit of what the financial incentive would be in terms of like Disney would distribute and then Warner Brothers would get a fee every time someone subscribes with the bundle. But why would these companies do this? Aren't they competitors, right? Well, so there's a few reasons. Deadline notes that this could reduce churn. So if you don't know what churn means, basically it's the rate at which people are unsubscribing from your program or subscription or software. And people are just going to be less likely to cancel if it means you're losing access to more than one service. So, if you have this bundle, you're like, I don't really like Disney Plus. You might hold on to that longer than you maybe would have otherwise, because if that means you're going to lose out on Max. And of course, you could always go and get a Max subscription on its own, but there is something against the idea of the convenience. And again, you do get it technically at a cheaper price, just as part of the whole thing. And again, this has been really helpful for Disney internally because, like I mentioned before, that Hulu Disney Plus integration, that has proven to be very successful. And again, that was done for similar reasons, right? Because it wants people to be using it, more people using Hulu and Disney Plus and using it for longer. And also why they would do this is that, again, by essentially offering these services at a discount, it would be the most cost-effective option for consumers that already have a subscription to all of those. So, like, for example, I might switch to this. So, like, right now in our household, I pay for Disney Plus and Max, and my fiance Viviana pays for Hulu. At a certain point, we might just, it gets tricky because I think I have yearly subscriptions for Disney Plus and Max. So it's like I would have to pay for the service that I already have because I might not be expiring until like the winter, like the end of this year. But that could be an option, right? So it's, that would be really beneficial for consumers, right? And again, like I said, this is a huge deal, right? So Disney Plus and Hulu and Max are major players in the streaming space, right? I believe those are like basically the biggest services behind Netflix and Prime Video, if you want to count Prime Video. But again, Prime Video's number's a little dubious because it's really just Prime subscribers, but Amazon doesn't release the actual number of people like specifically using Prime Video, because if you just want to get free shipping, you get Prime Video, right? So really after Netflix, Disney and Warner Brothers are the most successful in this space. And again, this is an equally beneficial partnership, right? Because Disney has a huge incentive here because they make up 2/3 of this bundle. And then for Warner Brothers, Max gets more visibility and probably more subscriber growth than Disney is going to get out of this. Because I think you might have families that are looking at this wanting to save some money, and the parents already want, maybe even thinking about getting Max. So it's like Disney's going to bring people into the Max ecosystem, right? So the question is this the future? or people have been talking about, joking about, whatever verb you want to use there. People have been talking about how streaming is basically just slowly becoming cable again in terms of like the business models and business structures, right? I'm not quite sure, but this is definitely the idea of the bundle is definitely something people are, that's like the red flag for a lot of people in terms of like, is streaming becoming cable? So we have a quote here from David Zaslav, who's the CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery, who we have pictured here, saying, quote, "It does feel like this is a moment in terms of what the next year, 2 years will bring. The business will look a lot different in 2 to 3 years. It will be a lot better for consumers," end quote. So clearly there is hope that this model will be better for consumers, but only insofar as it is then makes it better for the companies, right? I have another quote here from J.B. Perrette, who is the CEO and president of Global Streaming and Games at Warner Brothers Discovery. I always wonder, executives with long tails like that, like, how do you fit it all on your business card? Anyway, we have a quote from him here saying, quote, "Even if they don't use a service in 1 month, consumers still feel like they're getting great value and they might use it the next month. And so it's got a lot of rationale by pulling these together and makes us all be able to go back to investing in the areas that we really are great at," end quote. So again, this idea that people feel like they'll be less likely to unsubscribe because they feel like they're still getting a good value overall. And it's like, okay, maybe I didn't use Disney Plus this month, but it's not worth canceling because I'll probably use it next month, right? So in terms of maybe potential partnerships, people have been talking about Peacock and Paramount Plus doing some kind of similar bundle, but of course that's all up in the air with Paramount's current like corporate merger and acquisition drama, so I'm not gonna get into that. I did do a video about Peacock and Paramount doing a bundle for their services. At least I think I did. I've been doing the show for, like 3 months basically at this point, more than 3 months. So I can't remember if I did. It may have been one of my first stories I did on the channel. But we can't talk about streaming without talking about Netflix, right? And Netflix has avoided doing any kind of bundles like this. There have been bundles that were not Netflix driven. So like your phone carrier might give you like a Netflix and Max bundle, but that's not Netflix and Warner Brothers making a deal with one another. It's just your carrier doing that, right? So is there an opportunity here? So I was trying to think like, well, who would Netflix bundle with? It could be with Disney and Warner Brothers, maybe do a trifecta, which would essentially, be huge. That would be huge. That would be story number 1 if that happened. But I don't see that happening. Because I think Netflix sees Disney and Warner Bros. As their biggest potential competitors, even if they're not quite right now, like they could be. So they don't want to necessarily help them take more share of the market, right? So I'm trying to think again. I don't think they would do it with Prime either. Paramount and Peacock wouldn't really help Netflix at all. So I had the idea. This was my original idea. So if you hear anyone else saying it, they're copying me, the person who only gets a couple hundred views, maybe, on a video. I think Netflix should step outside of the film and TV realm and partner with Microsoft and do a Netflix Xbox Game Pass bundle. So if you don't know what Xbox Game Pass is, it's essentially this is an overused phrase, but essentially it's Netflix for gaming. It's Microsoft offers for a monthly fee access to this huge library of games, both Microsoft-owned titles as well as just third-party titles. I think that could be a great opportunity to kind of cross those markets, and, that would help Netflix because you have a bunch of these games. And, gamers need to have expendable income, right? So if they think they can get a better deal on Game Pass by getting Netflix, they will absolutely do it. But then it helps Game Pass because, again, it's still not something that is widely used. And I believe the numbers have kind of stagnated or plateaued. So this would really help Microsoft. So there is the opportunity of getting creative with that. But maybe they won't be creative. I don't know. I'm always surprised at what businesses decide to do and not to do. But, because of the current economy right now in terms of the entertainment industry and streaming is just kind of starting to get rehabilitated over the past couple of years. So maybe they don't want to try anything too risky, but that would be my big swing idea. But coming back to the story at hand in terms of the streaming bundle, I mean, I'm not really for or against this, because you can still get them separately. It's as compared to the cable bundles of yore, when you were forced to pay for channels you really didn't want. And theoretically, this will lower the cost if you get the full bundle. If you're already paying for these, memberships and subscriptions, this can only help you. So, I mean, I'm fine with it. Again, I think it's not, of all of the ways that streaming is becoming cable, I don't know if this is the worst one or the most disastrous. Okay, let me grab a quick drink here. Okay, let's talk about story number 3. So Nintendo has announced that it will announce. So this is an announcement about an announcement. So Nintendo has said that it will announce the Switch successor console, quote, within this fiscal year. So for Nintendo, that would be at some point before the end of March 2025. So within the next 10 months, Nintendo will officially reveal whatever is going to be the console after the Nintendo Switch, whatever that would be called, whether it be called Switch 2 or Super Switch or New Switch or whatever, or maybe something completely different, because Nintendo's always weird with how they name their consoles. Wii is a household name, but I remember when it was first announced, everyone was like, what does that even mean? We have a quote here from Shuntaro Furukawa, please excuse me, who's the president of Nintendo, saying, quote, "It will have been over 9 years since we announced the existence of the Nintendo Switch back in March of 2015. We will be holding a Nintendo Direct this June regarding the Nintendo Switch software lineup for the latter half of 2024, but please be aware that there will be no mention of the Nintendo Switch successor during that presentation," end quote. So for context, if you aren't aware, a Nintendo Direct, essentially a press conference that Nintendo will do, and sometimes they'll be really big and long, and they'll have really huge announcements. Sometimes they'll be smaller. I think those are called mini directs. So there is going to be a Nintendo Direct this June, but they're basically putting it out now. Don't expect any announcements about the Switch 2. We're not going to talk about it, so don't get your hopes up. So what's the precedent? So what was the timeline for the original Switch in terms of its announcement and reveal and then eventually release? So that quote explained, the original Switch was initially announced in March of 2015, but it wasn't revealed or anything. We didn't know what it was called. We didn't know what it was going to look like, or they didn't reveal the features and how you can take it on the go and then plug it into your TV. At this time, it was just called codename NX, and it was just going to be the successor to the Wii U. It was finally revealed as the Switch and had the full trailer for the console, revealed in October of 2016, and then was released in March of 2017. So that's what, 5 or 6 months between announcement and release. So if the latest they're going to reveal this thing is March of 2025, then I would say at the latest we're going to have a Switch 2 within the next 18 months, right? But again, that's up in the air, right? So supposedly this console was originally slated for the end of this year, of late 2024, but due to, what have you, it is slipped to March 2025 at the earliest. So it may not even make that March date. But again, if it did, then that would track with the original Switch's timeline. They have this Nintendo Direct in June, so I could see them sometime in the fall doing a full reveal, coming out, Switch 2 releasing this April or May or whatever it might be. So what would be in a Switch 2? Or what would a Switch 2 even be? So some potential features that people have speculated about, or there's been leaks about, but of course leaks aren't always reliable, because there was leaks about the Switch when it was codename NX that turned out to be completely false. But what people are thinking about or speculating about is that it will have magnetic Joy-Cons, so the Joy-Cons being the controllers on the side. So right now they kind of use a little rail, so they kind of click in. Supposedly the Switch 2 would have magnetic Joy-Cons, so they would just click on that way. But you'd still be able to use your old controllers as well. The portable version will have a 8-inch screen compared to the current Switch's 6.2-inch screen. It would have full backwards compatibility with original Switch titles, with the original Switch's library, whether it be physical or digital. Presumably it would have better graphics, right? Because the Switch, was a huge step up from the Wii U, but by 2017 when the Switch launched, it was 4 years after the PS4 and the Xbox One had come out. So, it was always behind, and this would be no different. It would definitely be behind the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. But it would still, compared to the original Switch, it would be much better graphically. So, probably ray tracing would be involved. 4K output when docked would be something that most people would expect, as well as having an internal memory of 256 gigabytes. So what do I think is going to happen here? Or what could the Switch 2 be like? What's really exciting and interesting about Nintendo when it comes to their consoles is you never fucking know what they're going to do, right? So it's kind of a fool's errand to try to predict, right? Because there's really only two options. The options are it's going to be like something we've seen before, or it's going to be completely different. But you can never... I don't think anyone anticipated the Wii. Some people maybe anticipated the Switch due to it being kind of similar to the Wii U, but Nintendo was always surprised. Personally, I think I would put my money on this being an improvement on the Switch, not a complete overhaul. And this doesn't completely track, but if you look at Nintendo's history of releasing consoles, it more or less follows a pattern of innovating and improving. Innovating and improving. So you have the original Nintendo Entertainment System completely, revolutionizing and essentially creating the home console market in like an actual substantive way. And then the Super Nintendo was the NES, but better. Then you have the Nintendo 64, which introduced 3D graphics and, now had needed a joystick to actually manipulate the camera and stuff. And that was really revolutionary. And the GameCube did that, but better or improved on. Then you have the Wii, obviously hugely revolutionary in terms of the motion controls, and while it maybe in retrospect was kind of more of a fad, it was obviously hugely popular and completely changed the conversation. The Wii U was that, but improved in certain ways, right? Maybe not business strategy improved, but it was everything the Wii was, but more or better. Then you have the Switch that, again, completely revolutionized the idea of basically merging the home console and handheld console markets. So I think whatever the follow-up is going to be, whatever it's going to be called, is basically going to be the Switch, but better. Just more of that, or more refined, or more improved, right? Notably, though, all the follow-up consoles I mentioned were always less successful than the originals. So the SNES sold less than the NES, the GameCube sold less than the 64, the Wii U sold less than the Wii. So if history is anything to go off of, this will be a doubling down on the Switch's design philosophy, but improved. But it may not sell as well, because people will be like, well, why do I need this? I already have a Switch. This isn't to say that there won't be some new kind of gimmick. So again, like I think of the Wii U that was everything the Wii was, but more, better graphics and all this stuff. But it also introduced the Wii, the gamepad, right? So this isn't to say that it's just going to be a really, really powerful Switch. But I think in general, it's not going to be a huge, completely, they're not going to reinvent the wheel here, right? And I think a bare minimum is just going to be that increased graphical capability. Again, just to compete, because at this point, the Switch is really starting to show its age. I remember everyone was talking about how impressive the newest Zelda Tears of the Kingdom was, considering how old the Switch hardware was at this point. But I think that's the exception that proves the rule. That game is impressive in spite of the hardware, not because of it. So it's gonna be I'm really excited to see what they end up doing for this. But again, we're probably not gonna really know anything for at least a couple more months. Well past, probably maybe near the end of the summer, if not the fall. Okay, let me just grab a quick drink here. Okay, let's talk about story number 4. So you could see it here. I love when I do a story, because I always have to come up with my graphics. that you see on the screen here. And it's always exciting when the story is the graphics. So we finally have our first look at the new Superman suit for the new Superman film coming out next year in 2025. So James Gunn, who's the writer and director of the film, who's also kind of spearheading the DCU, if you will, the DC universe, the DC's second answer to the MCU. Gunn posted this image on social media, revealing the suit to the world, saying, quote, "The above photo was taken on set by Jess Melio and was entirely in camera," end quote. So this is our first look at David Cornsweet in the role. So just a sidebar here. What a career leveling up that this guy is doing. He's 30 years old, has been in a couple TV projects, the only thing I have ever seen him in was in Pearl, opposite Mia Goth, as like the guy that she kind of falls in love with, and to now he's gonna be Superman. It's incredible, and I wish him all the best until he comes out to be this awful person, in which case I never said that I was happy for him. And I believe that they released that this was done to beat the paparazzi from leaking the image, right? Because they've started shooting and stuff, and the paparazzi are always going to be all over things like this. You only think of paparazzi with like celebrities, like kind of more like salacious things or scandalous things. But if you think about it, there's a lot of money in trying to get the shot, the image of this new superhero, like iconic superhero, this new version of him, right? So this was a really important move to release like an actual photo that like was approved by the marketing or what have you. Because sometimes like certain costume design choices can look like shit when it's just taken with like a phone camera by like a voyeur or like someone from really far away, or not even if they're far away, but just like they're meant to look great in a film, not in like normal room lighting, right? So this was definitely important and I'm happy that this is the first time we're seeing it, as opposed to, for Deadpool and Wolverine in the trailers we've gotten now to see Hugh Jackman in the iconic yellow jumpsuit from the comics. But we had already seen that in leaked set photos, right? Or at least I had. So it kind of took away a little bit of the magic from getting to see that in the trailer. But this is not just cool for its own sake, but this is an important moment. The Hollywood Reporter notes that, only 3, as opposed to some other superheroes, only 3 people, and now 4, if you count David Cornsweet, only 3 people have played the character, have played Superman in feature films on the big screen. So this isn't counting, serials from the 40s and 50s. It's not counting animated stuff. It's not counting TV stuff. In terms of like actual feature film, theatrical films, there hasn't been many people that have gone to play this role, because Christopher Reeve was so iconic and he played him for basically a decade, and then it wasn't touched until Superman Returns. And Brandon Routh, I think no one complained about that movie because of Brandon Routh, but that movie obviously just didn't catch on, so obviously that didn't go anywhere. And then you have Henry Cavill in the DCEU, but that just had issues because people felt like that character wasn't really Superman in a lot of ways. So this is a big deal that we're getting to see this new generation's Superman. And ultimately, I feel like this picture, why it was released, and what people are talking about regarding it, it's really less about the suit and more about getting a sense of the movie's vibes. Because this is both doubling as our first look at the suit, but also really it's our first real look at the film and like what the vibe is going to be, right? So there's a couple of things of note here. So I really feel like this image emphasizes the man in Superman. The idea of him being, he has superpowers, but who he is a human in terms of his nature, right? So, this seems really simple, but I think it is really important in communicating this. We have this banal task of him putting on his shoes, right? I don't think I've ever seen Superman put on his shoes before, right? It makes it feel more tactile. Like, this is not just something he just goes into the phone booth and spins around and flies out and he's gonna save the day. This is like a dude who is obviously superpowered, but like still has to do shit to be a superhero, right? And I'm not the only person who, to kind of take it one step further, Mark Hughes from Forbes made the comparison to like a working class man, like he's putting on his boots to go to the factory, right? It speaks to, and also the fact that he's putting on his boots. He doesn't look super concerned or rushed while there's like a giant alien catastrophe happening outside. So because of that, I think that enforces the idea that, as Gunn has made it clear, this is not an origin story. And maybe this speaks to a Superman who's been at this for a while. So it's kind of like him, because the original title of the film was going to be Superman Legacy. And then ultimately James Gunn decided it should just be called Superman. But that also speaks to this idea that maybe this is a Superman who has been at this for a little bit. Not like it's like he's been at this for 50 years or something, but maybe he's been at this and is starting to reflect on the impact that he has had and the impact that he could have, right? And again, this is not like a particularly heroic image, but in a good way. Again, it really emphasizes his humanity. It's something I've noticed. The suit almost looks homemade. Kind of like, even though they're separate universes, I don't want to cross wires here, but it kind of reminds me of Robert Pattinson's Batman, right? It feels homemade. Like, it feels like someone made this, as opposed to a lot of times Superman's suit just almost as like part of his skin, almost. Like, you just can't imagine him not wearing it. And Deadline even called it, quote unquote, rugged. So I think that's a really apt description there. But again, like I mentioned before, that alien, whatever's going on in the background there, it's colorful, right? So maybe we've gone past gray superhero movies, especially that we saw in the DCEU, right? And this is something I was not aware of in terms of like Superman suit discourse, but apparently it's a really big deal. He has the trunks. He has the red underpants outside the pants. And apparently that's a really big deal because I guess he doesn't always have that in appearances, both on screen and also like in the comics. But that's more classic and iconic, more faithful to the original, design of the character. We have a quote here that kind of gets into this and explains why this is important, I guess, in more detail. William Goodman at GQ writes, quote, "The trunks are an ideological litmus test. Gunn's decision to go with the trunks is a literalization of his desire to return to the classical conception of Superman as a big blue Boy Scout, saving kittens from trees and helping the common folk, rather than the tortured Christ-like figure rather than the tortured Christ-like figure that Superman became in the Snyderverse," end quote. So yeah, this idea that it's you're going to feel about the trunks however you feel about Gunn's interpretation. Like Gunn really seems to be reacting to the Henry Cavill characterization that Zack Snyder, his version and vision of the character, right? So ultimately, that decision and all of these things, ultimately it shows Gunn's intentions to make creative choices as opposed to a film made by committee, right? And I talked about that in my previous story about Disney and Marvel reducing the output, that, people want to see, but I think the main thing that's going to save the MCU and just superhero films in general is filmmakers actually making films and they have something to say. And it doesn't need to be like this like strong moral point or like the moral of the story, the lesson, what have you, but just like an actual point of view and a vision. And I think we're seeing here, I'm not a huge fan of Gunn's work. Like I am a little more tepid, or what's the word? Like I'm a little more lukewarm about the Guardians of the Galaxy films. But this at least shows, and I can respect those films, that at least it feels like a director with a vision. And hopefully he's able to kind of bring that over here as well. In terms of reactions to this, it's really run the gamut. So, Uprocks notes that some thought it was an AI generated image, which I'm not sure why you would think that. But what have you. So I have some reactions here. User Giselle B1234 on Twitter, also known as X, saying, quote, "David Cornsweat's Superman curl is literal perfection," end quote. And yeah, he definitely captures again like that kind of like the guy from GQ said, like that, that Boy Scout kind of aesthetic. James Zen Paladin 011 on Reddit writes, quote, "Looks good to me. Realistic, but still with a comics kind of pop, like a live action Incredibles kind of vibe, which is a good tone to hit in my humble opinion," end quote. But not everyone is happy about this. So we have a quote here from at Jason LeBoy Photo on Twitter saying, quote, "Dear Lord, he has on red trunks. This cosplay suit is terrible," end quote. MAKG Snake on Twitter said, quote, "Arg, this is such a bad suit and horrible reveal. Why is the suit loose on Superman? How is it washed out? The damn dumb trunks are back, and why is he putting on shoes when there's end of the world stuff happening in the background? I wanted this to be fake, ... It isn't," end quote. And again, more kind of critiques of this. Screen Rogue on Twitter said, quote, "That is the ugliest Superman suit ever," in all caps, ever, end quote. And Eric Kane at Forbes. So these aren't just people like on Twitter, just like normal people. People, actual writers are kind of sharing their takes on it. And Eric Kane at Forbes wrote an article titled, quote, "James Gunn's first Superman image looks like AI and the suit doesn't fit," end quote. And kind of summarize his point is that he just thinks this looks like shit. The image looks like shit. The suit looks like shit. And he's not very happy about it. I like this for all the reasons. I'm not super particular about the suit design. I'm not like a purist about anything. I think it looks pretty good for the reasons why I said I like how it kind of looks homemade. And again, this image is less about the suit and more about the vibe of the movie. The vibe that it's giving me, right? But again, I don't know. I'm curious when we're going to get a trailer for this. Probably not until the fall. Because this doesn't come out until July of 2025, and they're still shooting. If they really want to try to get something out in the summer to like put in front of Deadpool and Wolverine or something, but I could see this not debuting until September, October, or even like November or December, like getting closer to like kind of like the mini blockbuster season of November and December. But only time will tell. Okay, let me just grab a quick drink here. Okay, let's talk about story number 5. So this is another chapter in the ongoing Paramount merger and acquisition drama. This is not necessarily a huge development, but this is just a little bit more insight into what's going on. So I'm going to briefly summarize this. I've done a gajillion videos about this. You can find them on my channel. I literally have a whole playlist for Paramount-related videos. So in short, Paramount, looking for a potential buyer or merger opportunity, had a lot of different people interested. The one that Sherry Redstone, who's the, basically owns all of Paramount through her company, National Amusements, was really into the idea of merging with Skydance Media, David Ellison's company, primarily because it would keep the media empire together, and also she would get a enhanced premium on her shares. Shareholders are not super happy about that, and Apollo Management Group, Apollo Global Management, along with Sony, have now made a $26 billion offer for the entirety of Paramount Global, which Redstone would not necessarily be super into, but shareholders would like a lot more. And a big thing that people were talking about was, again, this idea of keeping all of the assets together. And I think Sherry Redstone was concerned, because originally Apollo made an offer by themselves. And I think she was hesitant to consider that offer because private equity, they're not sentimental. They'll, if this vertical or horizontal or whatever direction it's supposed to be, if something's not working, they'll sell it off, or they'll gut it, or whatever it might be. So the idea was maybe if Sony is involved in this joint offer, Sony, they have experience in entertainment, specifically film, right? They bought Columbia Pictures back like in the late 80s, early 90s. That might kind of be a little bit more reassuring. But it turns out Sherry Redstone had every right to fear this potential deal because reportedly Sony and Apollo plan on breaking up Paramount Global if their acquisition is successful. So basically breaking up every major piece of it. So that would include CBS, selling it off to someone else. This would include their cable channels like MTV and Nickelodeon. So you can see here on screen, SpongeBob would be very sad to be broken up with all of his friends at MTV. Paramount Plus, the streaming service, get rid of it, right? New York Times notes that Sony would want to combine these efforts with another studio. So kind of instead of having their own service, maybe just like making a deal with like a Peacock and just having all Paramount content on Peacock. And of course, Sony famously has remained essentially what you would call an arms supplier in the streaming wars rather than being an active participant. It's one of the few, I think maybe the only that major studio that doesn't have its own streaming service. And in retrospect, that was a really smart move on Sony's part. Sony, if they would also, in terms of breaking up the company, they would also want to sell off the studio lot, the iconic Paramount Pictures lot pictured here. Because they already own a huge studio lot from the Columbia acquisition. So this Paramount Studios lot, this is iconic real estate. So as film productions gear up or kind of start building back up following now the strikes, and more austerity in Hollywood, as you start to see more and more productions, that's going to be really valuable real estate. So really, what would be retained? So Paramount Pictures would really be the only thing retained. Deadline reports that, unlike with other mergers, right? So if you look at like 20th Century Fox, for example, a Disney acquiring that company, they still release films under the successor label of 20th Century Studios. But the output has been significantly reduced, right? So that would be an argument of antitrust where it's like this combination of this has reduced options for consumers in the market, right? But Deadline reports that the output would not be reduced. And the idea would be that along with Paramount Pictures and then Columbia Pictures and all of the film studios and productions and production companies under those umbrellas, if anything, they would not only now have double the output, but then they would scale that up to try to compete with the other streamers. Again, if they were to make a deal with like a Peacock, they could really give them a huge swath of content to give them. But again, this is Sherry Redstone's disaster scenario. This isn't even like, oh, you might lose CBS, you might lose it. This is literally dividing up the entire thing. And again, like I said, she really wants to keep the media empire that her father, Sumner Redstone, had built over decades. She wants to keep it all together as, a testament to her father's legacy or what have you. And this is, again, one of the many reasons that the Skydance deal was really attractive to her. And again, like I said before, I'm more than happy to admit when I'm wrong, because usually I'm right. But when I am wrong, I'll admit it. And I was wrong here. I thought that Sony being involved would increase the likelihood of, Paramount being able to stay intact. I thought Sony's involvement would ensure the company's kind of status quo, at least in the short term. But it seems like this would be this would be an immediate course of action. So could this happen? Does this make the Sony Apollo offer or that potential deal more likely or less likely? Overall, I would say this makes this deal less likely. But it's not impossible, right? The New York Times reports that according to an insider that they spoke to, that it, quote, wouldn't necessarily be a deal breaker if the offer was compelling, end quote. To which I ask, what would make the deal compelling? Is it more money? Is it higher premiums for Sherry Redstone? Is it like what would need to change about this offer to make it compelling, quote unquote compelling, the way that this person is talking about? So again, it's really interesting. Again, as a person as a consumer, I'm generally against like huge mergers and acquisitions like this. But if I was just purely business, from a purely business perspective, the Sony Apollo deal seems like the best bet. That, the Paramount brand isn't necessarily helped by having all of these other assets like MTV, Nickelodeon, and CBS and Paramount Plus. So I think it would be the thing that it would keep Paramount lean. And again, the output from just Paramount would increase because Sony really wants to level up the output, their just general film output, right? So it seems like the only person that this deal would really hurt is Sherry Redstone in her pride. But so if I was a businessman or if I was actually involved, I would say this is the deal. This is the deal to take. But I'm not an insider. So, take all of this for what you will. Who knows what Paramount's going to do? There is a high chance now that shareholders are revolting with the Skydance deal, and this Sony deal seems anathema to what Sherry Redstone wants to do. There is a high likelihood now that she's just going to end up not selling at all, which I think is really going to hurt the stock price. Okay, before wrapping up, let's just look at the films coming up this upcoming weekend. So the big movie coming out this weekend is going to be If, Imaginary Friend. This is the John Krasinski directed film about imaginary friends, kind of a mixture of CGI and live action stuff. The trailers seem cute. I have no idea how this is going to be. I don't know. It either could be really, really charming or really, really annoying, and it could just have a huge thud at the box office. But right now it's projected to my projections, because I'm now going to start making my own projections based off of data. I'm projecting this is going to open anywhere from 38 to 43 million for the weekend. So not awful, right? But not going to be as big as some of those bigger films like Dune Part 2, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, things like that. Then we also have The Strangers Chapter 1. So I guess I really don't know nothing about this. So The Strangers, I guess, is like a horror franchise that's had like 2 other films. And this is The Strangers Chapter 1. And if I'm not mistaken, Chapters 2 and 3 are also coming out this year. So I don't know anything about this franchise, but the trailers seem generic horror. Is The Strangers a brand that matters? I don't know. But in any case, I'm projecting it's going to open anywhere from 9 to 11 million. So again, not super huge, but again, depending on its budget, that could be decent. And then finally, another film opening this week is going to be the Amy Winehouse biopic, Back to Black. I was quite excited for this movie just because I don't really know much about her. I could just watch the highly acclaimed documentary, Amy, if I really wanted to learn about her, but I'm lazy. But this has just gotten shit reviews, both from audiences and critics. So it's only tracking to make about 6 to 10 million in its domestic opening weekend, though I believe it has been open in England already. So again, we'll talk about that next week and see what its total worldwide box office is, but I think this is gonna kind of flop at the American box office. Okay, so this is the part of the show where I plug the best film I watched this week. This is this could either be a film I've seen 100 times, it could be a film I've seen only once, it could be a film that came out yesterday, it could be a film that came out 100 years ago. Whatever the best film I watched this past week, I want to give a shout out, and it's going to be War for the Planet of the Apes. What a great fucking movie. I had seen all of the rebooted Planet of the Apes films but leading up to the new one coming out, and I'm going to see it this Thursday, I wanted to rewatch all these because it's been some time. And I remember watching this and liking it, but I remember being really tired when I watched it. So I was kind of just like waiting for it to be over so I could go to sleep. Because I was watching it with someone. I couldn't just like pause and finish it. Like they really wanted to watch it. I think it was like his birthday. It was like my roommate, and it was his birthday, so we watched it, and I felt really bad because I just did not enjoy the experience of watching it. And I was always like, I bet I would really like this movie if I actually just watched it and wasn't about to pass out. And I was right. It's so great. It's definitely the best of that trilogy. So if you haven't seen it or haven't watched any of the rebooted Planet of the Apes films, I highly recommend you go check those out. Okay, just want to give a few quick plugs before we wrap the show up. So I also have a sister YouTube channel called Peter Squared, where I cover topics related to film and media and entertainment in a more formal video essay format. The video I have up now is called A Closer Look at Frozen, where, you guessed it, I take a closer look at the Disney film Frozen, take a look at what went right, what went wrong, and everything in between, using these 2 cartoon versions of my old and young self. You can find that at the link in the description below. It really would be a huge help if you could go check that out, watch the video, give it a like, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Also want to plug a podcast that my fiance Viviane and I do together called Now That's What I Call a Franchise, where we pick a film franchise and we go through every single installment. The good, the bad, and the ugly. We just spent our last season covering the huge Batman franchise. This upcoming Friday, in just a few days, we're going to be starting our next season on the Addams Family. So highly recommend you go check that out. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube if that's how you listen to your podcast. And you can also just go to the link in the description below. And then finally, want to plug again Cinema and Q. So it's not just the YouTube channel. It started as and still is a Substack newsletter where I write more formal written reviews for new films coming out every week. Highly recommend you go check that out. It really would be a huge help to me. It really would make my heart sing if I could get some new subscribers to that newsletter. You can find that in the link in the description. You can also just go to your browser and type in cinemanqso.substack.com. That's it for this week. Hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all next Monday. Peace out.